Hello everyone, my name is Justice Clifford and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Co-op. Today I'm pleased to bring you a new Q&A series form of Ed Talks where we're going to sit down one-on-one with guests to discuss your electricity and your local not-for-profit electric. Today I am pleased to be joined by the Ed Talks namesake himself, President and CEO Ed VanHoose.
I mean, it's important that we talk about this stuff, but how do you do that and get people to relate to it in a way that makes sense to them? You know, so
I think that's one of our biggest problems too, is having them understand it and seeing the bigger picture, like what we have to do. So
yeah. Well, and then, all right. So right now we have the entire East Coast, and then parts of the Southeast that are flooded, and the East Coast is just in horrible conditions. You have 500,000 people without power, right? But we're not being impacted here right now. So we're giving warnings to people and telling them, hey, prepare because we see this potential shortage happening. But it's not happening right this second. So it's one of those things you have to prepare for the eventuality, which might not come soon. It might be not even this year. Maybe it's next year that happens, right? But when we see organizations like this warning us and sending out things that they've never done historically. So you have PJM and NERC and all these reliability focused organizations sending stuff out, and they've never done that in their entire history. That's really hard to not sit up and take notice.
mm-hmm.
But how do we get that across to people in a way that's meaningful to them when it may not be happening right that moment? Or, sometimes when we're recording stuff like this, there's a delay, obviously, in recording because it's not broadcasted live right this second. So you have that delay. We could record it right now when nothing's happening, and then, with the forecast for this weekend being what it is, you could have an event actually
mm-hmm.
occur, right? Or maybe not, because it's all weather dependent. So who the heck knows when it could happen, but we have to prepare regardless of when it's going to happen. It's kind of like, I was thinking about stories that people can relate to. And so, like that accident that I was in, right? So I pull over to the side of the road because stupid GPS was telling me to go the wrong direction. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. I'm going to pull over, I'm going to look at it and fix it, right? And I pull over, and I get ready to pull back out again after correcting things and making sure that I'm going the right way. And I looked, and there's no one coming. And I looked again, and there's no one coming. And I looked again, and there's no one coming. So 3 times I looked, and there's no one coming. And then I pulled out, and someone hit me because there's someone coming. So it's kind of very similar to that because we are constantly warning and constantly warning and constantly looking and constantly trying to be prepared, right? But there's nothing coming right this second. But all it takes is for that temperature to dip just a little bit enough, and then have a certain demand in electricity at that same time. And now that car does come out of nowhere and just blow you out of the highway. And that's what I'm kind of worried about for people. How do you make sure that they have the information they need, that we're giving them, what is necessary for them to be prepared, even when it may not be happening right this moment. I mean, we can see the writing on the wall. You see these organizations putting this information out there, but just trying to make sure that people are prepared for what could potentially come.
Well, so let's start with that. I mean, having people understand what PJM is, these aren't common acronyms that people see every day. So
Right.
How do we explain what PJM is to an average member?
I kind of think of it as, so it isn't actually a power marketing group. That's another organization we use for that. But I kind of think of it that way. So we have this regional entity that is responsible for reliability of our grid. And they're responsible for it in that they monitor what is needed to meet the demands in a certain area at any given moment in the day. And they try to do that with a forward look based upon what they see happening, but also what they see happening in the future, but also what they see happening at the current moment. It's a very hard job, especially given, I mean, it's a 12-state organization, so this is a large organization, and it's one of many in the country, right? So we have this organization trying to manage the ins and outs of power being generated and power being consumed on behalf of the entire 12-state region it's in times when we're seeing unprecedented retirements of baseload generation, like coal in particular going offline and being replaced with non-dispatchable generation like wind and solar. So it's not like wind and solar is a bad thing to add to the grid, because it has a place and it works. It's just that it's not dispatchable in that you can't just turn on the sun when you want, you can't turn on the wind when you want, and you can if you're using one of those baseload generation types. So PJM handles those ins and outs for us on behalf of the grid at large. It's a grid operator.
Well, now, recently I read that PJM is getting ready to, well, has announced that there's going to be 25 gigawatts of power that's being retired, and that's 119 million homes that could be powered. How are we supposed to get through and have reliable electric if something like that's happening?
So that is some of the concerns that they have, right? And not just them, but also NERC. That's another federal agency that's a division of FERC, and there's a lot of IRC, I know. But yeah, that is a big concern from them and from us, because when you retire that much baseload generation, and the plan is to replace it with non-dispatchable generation, like I just talked about, it makes it very difficult to handle those ins and outs, especially if you have extreme weather events. Now, on a given day, if you have moderate weather, you have typical load, capacity is running like it should, you're not going to have those kind of issues, right? But what happens when you have extreme weather events, where it's either super cold or super, super hot, and you have additional load happening, additional load capacity happening, where you need more, right? Then is when you're going to have these extreme potentials for large power outages. And so that's really what everyone's concern is that we are moving so fast away from other dispatchable sources to non-dispatchable sources that there's this disorderly transition in how we're doing things. No one's saying that we can't eventually get there. What we're saying is, one, the technology that the government's trying to fund right now and saying that we should be using doesn't exist commercially. So it's not a viable alternative right this second. And second, you're pushing through regulatory pressures baseload generation offline too fast. So we need to slow down. You know, there was a letter that pretty much the entire Ohio delegation sent, including both sides of the aisle. Sherrod Brown signed on to it, just like Jordan signed on to it. All of them did. Sent to the EPA to say, look, we understand what you guys are trying to do, but you need to slow down because you're going to impact people's livelihoods and also the potential to cause widespread issues from a health and safety standpoint, just like what happened in Texas just a few years ago.
More and more electricity in this country. So this is a trend of facing risk during extreme temperature events this trend has been developing for years, and each year the risk gets a little greater. Just last winter we had rolling blackouts in 9 states in the mid-Atlantic area during a cold snap. So this is not theoretical.
We're on this trend, and we're sounding the alarm not just for this winter, but looking out over the next several years. Do we want to keep going down this path where it becomes more and more likely, or do we want to make sure we're making better decisions to mitigate that risk? This report shows we're at risk of having reliability problems and blackouts. We shouldn't have policy that's encouraging the shutdown of always available power plants.
So this is not a political issue where one side of the aisle is saying, this is the wrong thing to do. This is agreed upon by just about everybody that we need to find another path forward to get here.
And we're not trying to say that we're against renewables or anything else like that. Well, like you had said previously, we're trying to say we need a common sense approach to be able to get to that point to where we have enough electricity for everybody to have that reliability.
Right, exactly. And so, my concern is, all right, we run a distribution cooperative here, right? That means local. So we handle that last mile of lines going to people's homes. We manage the substations associated with that. We don't own or operate the transmission system, which gets the power to that distribution system, and we don't own and operate the generation resources. We have contractual relationships for those types of things. So what can we do locally when those types of pressures are being applied? Well, not a lot, honestly. We can advocate. We can go to DC, and I do that. We can go to Columbus. We can make sure that we have contractual relationships in place to make sure that our power supply is sufficient to meet our needs. But we're just a tiny drop in the bucket, of the total amount. And remember, all this is interconnected with the 12-state region. So when you have that entire grid interconnected, even though our contracts say we have enough power to meet that, we're part of that regional entity, which means if others don't have enough, then it impacts us as well. So no, we're not against moving toward having more types of resources on the grid, and those may not even be things we know about right today. There could be other things coming. But what we are against is not having reliable electric supply. And as a distribution company, we have to be making sure that our members at the end of the line are taken care of. And so right now, for me, that means making sure they have the information that they need to make good decisions, encouraging them to think about self-generation in some way, shape, or form. And that could be installing a generator to run just some circuits in your home that you need in order to make sure that certain things are running. And maybe you have a freezer that's critical to you because that's where most of your family's meal storage is. Or maybe you have an oxygen need at home or some kind of medical monitoring device, and making sure that that thing has power. It may not mean that you need to have generation for your entire house during these types of periods, but at least enough to make sure that those critical circuits in your home are fed when we aren't receiving the power we need in order to power you.
So that brings up the big scary B word that everybody doesn't like to hear, blackouts.
Yep.
What is that going to look like if something like that happens in territory?
So this is kind of new territory for us in that just this past year we had to sign an agreement with PJM that we would take their direction and institute rolling blackouts if necessary to ensure grid stability. Now, why is it necessary for grid stability? Well, if the whole grid goes down completely, right, the startup time for that is much, much longer, to the tune sometimes of weeks, to get everything back up and running. If instead we can have a plan and we can say, well, we're going to rotate through certain parts of it and then still keep our capacity resources running during that time period, then getting everybody back online after that event is much quicker. And so it's important that people realize that should the capacity exceed the generation, capacity needs to exceed the generation out there, that we are going to need to institute those types of rolling blackouts. Now, let me also say this. Chances of our cooperative having to institute those at the present time are pretty low. But the forecast for the next few years show that PJM as a whole is not going to meet its requirements for generation. And so as we look to the future, that's really my big concern for people, making sure you're prepared if we do have to go down that path. The agreements are now in place. We will have to adhere to what we're told to do. So it is possible that this could happen. I don't think the likelihood is going to happen that this will be an extended thing right now. But over the next few years, I think that likelihood increases.
So what are the co-ops doing statewide, federally, and what can a member do to help advocate for electric reliability?
So the same things that I talked about that I'm personally doing, that our boards are doing, that our employees are focused on, the reason we're doing these types of videos is talk about it. Get educated, look at what we're putting out, look at what others are putting out, and then speak openly to your legislators. We have some pushes ourselves as far as call to actions. Send those back to your legislators, participate in those types of things. Make sure your voice is heard out there, because right now we have some political figures making decisions without consulting engineers. And that's a problem. You can't make decisions that affect people's livelihoods and lives without consulting engineers to make sure that the decision you're making is accurate.
So if there's one key takeaway that you want any members that are watching this to know, what would it be?
Protect yourself right now. Consider buying a generator or some self-generation. That could be a battery system. There's lots of options out there. Educate yourself and make sure that you're doing what's necessary to protect your own self at home and your family.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ed.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, good to talk to you.